Let me welcome all of you once again to this very interesting seminar. I got a message from Gopal Agrawal that he's stuck somewhere and he will be a little late. So let us start, and let me invite Shri Rajesh Agrawal, Additional Secretary in the Department of Commerce, to please kick off. And as I said, since we have about 9 speakers, may I request all of us to maintain some very strict timelines. And if you like, you may like to begin with, as I said often, is to begin with your conclusions and then build up to your, why have you reached upon those conclusions? Say about 5 to 7 minutes. Let us have, because I would also like you to also interact with each other and to respond to others' comments. So if you take 5 minutes, then I think we will be 45 minutes plus another 15 minutes. So we'll be able to maintain the timings well. Over to you, Rajesh.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta, and a very good evening to all of you.
And good morning to Mark. May I also introduce, we have one American friend, Mark Linscott. He used to be the US ATR at one time and is now working with us on various trade policy issues.
Yeah. Thanks.
And has done a lot of work in not only in multilateral trade, but including bilateral trade.
So thanks, Mr. Mehta. First of all, I think thanks for inviting me here, but I think you knowingly chose the wrong person, it seems, because I am a person who is now heading trade bilateral in the ministry. So I am the one who is now looking after trade negotiations, largely bilateral. But today I am here to talk about, and generally what I'll say, though I am not involved in multilateral activities and trade negotiations and things that happen in the ministry, but what I have picked up on the way, I'll try to share my personal candid thoughts around trade multilateralism and what I think is maybe a more balanced approach moving in future. That what I say may not be the stated position of the ministry or the government per se, because I don't actually look after the multilateral trade negotiations or multilateral trade ecosystem, which is handled by my colleague Piyush in the ministry. So I am caveated because some of it, what we'll say, will come from my heart and may not be the stated stand of the ministry or the government. So pardon me for that. First of all, I think India, if you look at India as a country, I think India, we have been, our Prime Minister has also been always talking of, we believe in the principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The entire earth is one, the entire globe is one family. If we believe in that, I think it's a very natural to us that as a country, we would be in support of a multilateral trade ecosystem. Multilateral rule-based trade ecosystem is normally a global good which will take care of all, irrespective of whether a country is on the initial stages of development trajectory or is on the is a very advanced stage of a development trajectory. Because multilateralism, the way the WTO, if you look at the way WTO is designed, which is the global multilateral trade body, it is a rule-based ecosystem. If you see the decision-making procedure in WTO also, wherein I think there are a number of 30-odd committees, if I understand, there is a General Assembly, there is a ministerial, different layer of ecosystem of trade-making, decision-making ecosystem. It provides for, and it provides for a consensus-based ecosystem wherein I think everybody gets an equal voice. So I think as a country who is looking at a globe as one family, I think we believe India would be always standing for promoting multilateral trade, a trade ecosystem with a rule-based trade ecosystem where every voice is heard. We also, if we, what I understand from our initial participation in WTO also, we have been somebody who has been a very strong votary of a special but differentiated treatment. And that whole idea of special but differentiated comes from the fact that we recognize that each country is not on the same stage of development. They are at a different stages of development, so their priorities and their sensitivities will be different, and that needs to be taken into account when we are looking at a multilateral trade ecosystem. Three, I think a multilateral trade ecosystem also is a very, it looks towards a very, I think, though there has been debates around where WTO has been doing well, it has been moving, not, there has been periods where we felt that WTO as a multilateral trade ecosystem has failed, not moved, done much. But I think the last ministerial, which was held in 2022, I think there was a substantial movement where countries came in together. I think India also, even US, I think came together to drive and see that there are some tangible outcomes of the ministerial. Just trying to reinforce that there is much left in the multilateral trade ecosystem, and we need to promote it, sustain it, promote it, and so that the global good is taken care of. There is a larger debate also around the plurilateral mechanisms that are now taking place, because as the geo-economic environment across the world also starts changing, sometimes this multilateral trade ecosystem, the decision-making, the consensus-based decision-making slows down. It becomes difficult to arrive at decisions, and that's why a lot of these bilateral mechanisms based on comparative advantages also start working on the sidelines to see that the trade and economies of the countries grow and people are able to reap benefit of the growing trade in their economies. But I think this plurilateral mechanisms, open plurilateral mechanisms, which are also now in play in WTO, I think is a, to my mind, though as a country we have not been a very we are against this idea of plurilateralism as a part of WTO, and we have ideologically opposed it. But I personally feel if these open plurilateral agreements are the ones which only bind signatories but also create benefits for non-signatories, and that may be a nice way to move forward and promote slowly multilateral, because there will be multiple issues which may be important for a global trade, or on which issues need to be resolved on a more to promote global trade in those areas. But it may be difficult to arrive at a wider consensus among the entire globe. So maybe this plurilateral open plurilateral mechanisms can provide a window wherein some movement can take place, and where the non-members also initially get some benefits, and gradually when they mature or move towards that, where they are ready to be a part of that mechanisms and things, they can also join to promote more and more multilateralism. This can be a good arrangement.
Can I interrupt you, Rajesh?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a very specific question which you are handling?
Yeah.
How can a closer bilateral relationship, including through new age cooperation, architecture such as IPEF, and effective collaboration in trade multilateralism be made mutually reinforcing?
See, IPEF is also, to my mind, as a regional trade arrangement, regional trading framework that is coming up. It's a very different kind of arrangement which has come up, but I think as I mentioned, at the WTO level, all the issues cannot be resolved. At a region, if we are able to resolve a lot of these issues through an IPEF mechanism, where a lot of harmonization of standards, regulations, and issues around that can take place, and as a region, we can move forward with a region which constitutes, I think, more than 40% of the world GDP, then I think largely, if this region is there, and then we can have this IPEF mechanism also do have a system where more people can also in years to come. It do have an open architecture where more members can also join in. Once the negotiations are complete, we'll do have a accession process and things like that. And members can also exit if they feel uncomfortable. There will be a entry and exit mechanisms for the members also. So I think that will promote that as people feel comfort at their own pace, they can be part of these arrangements and largely promote more regional, and then regional growing to a global trading order. So IPEF also, to that mind, I think today reflects more of the geoeconomics or geopolitics that plays out in the world. But maybe later comes in an architecture, it can evolve itself to follow the geoeconomics, because we also understand trade policy and the geopolitics also go hand in hand. They are not completely at crossroads with each other. There's a lot of common factors or common ground on which it earns. So That's why the nuance around an IPF is also that it can move. It is not something which is fixed in time, so that it can move. Each of the pillars that we are talking around there is also a very separate architecture, separate agreement, because and each of the partners also do have a choice to be part of one or many pillars, and there will be a mechanism where new partners can also join and the existing ones can exit. So the idea will be that you are able to reflect the geopolitics of today and move
Thank
in
you
that
very much,
direction.
Rajesh. Can I come back to you
Yeah,
after I?
yeah.
One thing, friends, I forgot to do is to deliver my welcome remarks, which I thought was very important. I don't know if you noticed it, but these are all senior moments, I suppose. And as I said, at the last India-US Trade Policy Forum meeting in January, both sides called for WTO reform, which builds trust in the multilateral trading system and enables the WTO to better advance its foundational objectives and respond to the needs of all our people. I wanted to especially highlight this paragraph in a bilateral context in terms of reinforcing the multilateral arena. Similar lines on reaffirming commitment to multilateralism and the WTO are standard issue in official statements and declarations. Also at a recent G20 events as well. The future of world peace and prosperity lies in a robust and well functioning multilateral order to deal with myriad complex issues of global governance, which includes trade, climate change, biodiversity, etc. Among these, the multilateral trading system under the WTO is essential as a core element. These are but truisms. The question therefore arises, are we really walking the talk? How do we go beyond lip service and actually demonstrate our shared commitment to trade multilateralism? Another recent trend has been to call for a rules-based global trading system among market economies and democracies, distinction in drawing the world to different kinds. This approach to multilateralism minus one is a mistake in our opinion. I've been a staunch multi-trade multilateralist for over 4 decades now. I firmly believe that it is impossible to conceive of effective trade multilateralism without China. Fortunately, the visit of US Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Beijing day before yesterday reflects the US maturity to pursue peace with one of their arch enemies and perhaps reconcile the differences to the best extent possible. I know, I mean, one cannot expect everything to come out of it, but howsoever. One of the reasons for the standoff among both giants, which is holding back progress at the WTO, is the US impression that China has gamed the system to their advantage by supporting their public sector units to do business with state support. China's retort is that the US and other Western powers have been gaming the system by their dirty farm subsidies without any sign of reforms. I mean, look at the cotton four, for example. I mean, there are several such instances. I'll not get into the details of that. In spite of farm sector reform, there seems to be a general underappreciation of the leadership yet. Leadership role the US has historically played in getting the multilateral trading system off the ground, and therefore it becomes much more surprising on the way US is behaving currently. In all these decades, I have seen the achievements of the multilateral trading system being gradually taken for granted, including by those who have been its biggest beneficiaries. A popular narrative in recent years has been that WTO is no longer fit for purpose, having failed to keep in sync with evolving global realities. That happens with any organization. It happens with you, me, and all of us. We have to continuously reinvent ourselves, reshape ourselves. We need to get countries like India and the US to invest more political capital in adapting with the multilateral trading system rather than abandoning it for less than multilateral approaches. Finally, while the old multilateralism created unprecedented global economic growth and partially reduced poverty around the world, it could not distribute it equitably among and within countries. I mean, there have been disturbances, including in the US, as we have seen. One of the reasons for election of Trump was the kind of discontent which was generated by globalization. With the US appetite for trade liberalization waning and the focus now on industrial policy and protectionism, Does this have the potential to shape a new multilateralism where economic benefits created are shared much more broadly? Where does this leave countries like India? Overall, the WTO and the larger multilateral trading system today seems to be a victim of its own success. How can we ensure the WTO retains its centrality to the multilateral trading system in the coming decades rather than being relegated to only playing a supporting role? How can India and the US collaborate towards these ends, the two biggest democracies in the world? The upcoming visit of Prime Minister Modi to the US is an opportune moment for the two sides to join hands and reiterate their shared commitment to the WTO and trade multilateralism, including working together to restore the two-tier dispute settlement mechanism. Even if the MTS is not discussed by the two leaders during this visit, they could do so well in September when Biden is expected to visit India during the G20 summit, September 9th and 10th. In any event, WTO reforms will be a part of the G20 summit declaration on which both Modi and Biden will have to sign off. Irrespective of outcomes, I think it is important that our efforts remain unwavering. Stronger bilateral ties can also have positive spillovers on cooperation in multilateral settings. In sum, leadership by India and the US is indispensable for the success of the multilateral trading system. And I'd like to underline this particular statement. There we are talking about the extent to which middle power should engage with the multilateral trading system. And India has already been sort of moving into a leadership role of the global south, and therefore it assumes, Agrawal Sahab, Rajesh, much more responsibility than what it does to look at things nationally. It should be able to look at things more from the southern perspective, that is the global southern perspective. We are very privileged to have a top-notch panel with us today to discuss how India and the US can work together to promote trade multilateralism. Let me once again welcome and thank all present for taking out the time and joining us today. To ensure a productive discussion, I request all our esteemed speakers to make brief, succinct, and pointed interventions. May I also apologize in advance to request speakers to terminate their comments in view of the time limitations. And Rajesh, with that, I would like to welcome you and to request Mark to speak. And as I said, Rajesh, I'll come back to you whenever you wish to. And any of you can raise hands also if you wish to interrupt any other speaker for very important reasons. But please try and limit your comments between 5 to 7 minutes so that we can, have a more sort of spirited discussion in this point on the three themes that we had sent you. Let me again repeat. One is what I have already requested Rajesh to speak about on a closer bilateral partnership through the new age cooperation architecture such as IPEF and effective collaboration in trade multilateralism. We made mutually reinforcing. Mark, you can kick off with that. And the other two themes is how can India and the US work together to shape the trade multilateralism in the future, and how can the two sides demonstrate their shared commitments to trade multilateralism? Can the two sides meet together to steer the WTO reform, which is a crying need, as I said. We all recognize that. This has been recognized by MC12 as well, and is going to be a major agenda in MC13. So, I'm busy in a webinar. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Pradeep. Thanks. And can everyone hear me okay? Great. Well, first of all, thanks. It's a real honor to be part of this group, and as the only American, I do think it's auspicious that Pradeep put me second in our lineup today, as I fear that I may end up being a bit of a skunk at the party by offering a somewhat pessimistic perspective on prospects for U.S.-India collaboration in the WTO and on multilateral trade. And after all, I'm the one former U.S. trade negotiator with plenty of battle scars and some cynicism born of my experience negotiating in the WTO with India over many years. There have been 12 WTO ministerial conferences, I negotiated for the United States in 7 of those, and I rarely experienced real examples of collaboration between our 2 countries. But that said, I hope to conjure up a few constructive yet realistic ideas on how India and the US can communicate better on WTO issues and can share ideas that might lead to future collaborative efforts. And I'm really looking forward to the advice and ideas from others in this discussion today. I'm starting with a brief history of the U.S.-India relationship and the WTO. I always engage in history on these issues. And, that history is mostly a series of situations involving each championing positions that were generally at odds on fundamental issues. However, I will conclude with examples of more positive and productive engagement between India and the US on trade matters, which may offer some foundation for a better future. So the history part of my comments includes the launch of the Doha round of negotiations in 2001, the failure in those negotiations to bridge huge gaps in positions, and ultimately the collapse of the Doha round. And the drift since then, only occasionally interrupted with some successful outcomes. At the beginning, U.S. negotiators viewed the central goals, U.S. central goals, to be new market access, particularly new tariff reductions and services commitments, with a real focus on the large developing countries, China, India, and Brazil, and also on new rules ranging from fisheries and agricultural subsidies to trade facilitation. India, on the other hand, led many developing countries in being focused on rewriting the existing WTO rules to allow more policy space for development concerns and ensuring more robust implementation of existing flexibilities associated with special and differential treatment, SDT. What made circumstances of the Doha round even more challenging was this principle of the single undertaking. In other words, that nothing could be agreed in any of the major areas of negotiation without all areas being agreed. And in the end, the expectations never matched up. Early high hopes eventually devolved into a true cesspool of mistrust, finger pointing, and stagnation. Now, the more hopeful part of the story is that eventually there were some successes, but that effectively required the death of the Doha round and the idea of the single undertaking. And it started with MC9, the 9th Ministerial Conference. This was in Bali in 2013, and the conclusion of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, also with an interim solution on agricultural public stockholding. The US, the United States, and India were the 2 delegations that negotiated together, along with the shuttle diplomacy of Roberto Acevedo, who was the WTO Director General at the time. We concluded agreement over 2 sleepless nights, and this is while most of the other delegations went back to their hotel rooms and slept. It was really the US and India together with Roberto hammering out a multilateral agreement. And I know because I was there with the USTR at that time, Mike Froman, in Geneva, Michael Punk. So we had a real success there. Another similar success occurred at MC10 in Nairobi in 2015. This was with the agreement on agriculture export competition, especially phase out and elimination of export subsidies. And then as Pradeep and Rajesh referred to, finally, last year, we witnessed the limited success of a new fisheries subsidies agreement at MC12 in Geneva. But I should leaven these more recent successes with the observation that all required both sides to go the absolute cliff edge of negotiations to eventually find and secure compromise that allowed new agreements. And in the meantime, the WTO has continued its long slide into diminishing relevance. Neither country has shown much appetite to commit to a new lease on life for trade multilateralism. India, on the one hand, has seemed a bit more focused on sustaining a fundamental divide in Geneva between developed and developing countries, even as some other developing countries are negotiating plurilaterally in the WTO, the so-called joint statement initiatives. India has been extremely hostile towards these efforts. taking a pretty definitive position that they are somehow WTO illegal. The United States, we've engaged in our own policies that undermine the WTO. This started with the Trump administration, the unilateral tariff increases on the grounds of national security. It's continued in the Biden administration with new industrial policies that are arguably inconsistent with core WTO obligations. The silver lining, this is really my summation here, the silver lining to all this is that India and the US have found other ways to engage in constructive discussion and negotiation on trade. And it's been primarily through the bilateral trade policy forum, the TPF, which Pradeep just referenced. The TPF has been around for roughly 15 years, but it's only been recently that it has broadened its agenda to areas like good regulatory practices, environment, and labor. It's offered opportunities for negotiating specific outcomes, even market access ones, and generally provided a structured and regular venue for discussing the full range of our trade interests. Quite honestly, I don't think bilateral collaboration on WTO, if it's even possible, is going to occur between Geneva delegations. I fear there's already too much bad blood there for too long. I don't think it's going to come through IPAF, which is much more focused on resilient supply chains and generally non-binding results that don't have WTO interests front and center. But I believe that the two trade ministers, and that's USTR, US Trade Representative's Office, where I spent my career, and the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, could introduce a new area of work in the trade policy forum that focuses on identifying shared WTO interests or shared interests that might eventually get traction in Geneva if India and US were to team up. So I'm ending here with a more positive note. Simply my 2 cents. I'm not highly optimistic about the future of the WTO, nor the commitment of the big players to preserving it, but movements by the US and India to collaborate, even in very limited ways, would be a game changer.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. That is excellent. And you've done it in 7 minutes' time. We must offer you an applause for having maintained very good time. I think the last point which you made was that we cannot afford, as I said in my opening remarks, we cannot afford to let the WTO, slide back. We have to keep it on and to strengthen it. But having said that, may I request Amita, 5 to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Pradeep, for having invited me today as part of this panel to discuss multilateralism and how India and US can work together to take the idea of multilateralism forward. I'm going to be a little more provocative than what has been stated by Mark earlier to say that I question the fundamental premise of India and US coming together to push forward the idea of multilateralism. And why I say this is because of the introduction that you yourself have given, Pradeep, in the sense of the belief that India has always had in multilateralism and the manner in which India has been struggling for the past few years to put forward the interests of the developing countries and particularly focus on issues of A, food security, B, as far as special and differential treatment is concerned. So the focus as far as India is concerned and the belief that India has, in terms of multilateralism comes from a completely different angle or dimension, In contrast, we have the United States, which I think at this point of time is very happily playing out its power contest, with China through, by violation of the multilateral system, I mean, it's not that the multilateral system has not been undermined earlier. I think in the first 2 decades, as we've seen the development of or Doha development agenda not lead anywhere, we've had trade agreements, that have really taken up the role of the WTO in taking forward regulatory policies or trade facilitating policies, basically, So the WTO has not been relevant for some time. Today, I think it's been challenged, and challenged by the actions of the United States. United States, whether it's in terms of unilateralism, the bilateralism, the tariff imposition on Chinese goods, or it has been, in terms of the new acts that it has cleared recently in the form of IRA, consolidating in an exclusionary manner regionalism within North America, So I think the United States is operating in a very, very different manner in terms of not abiding by multilateralism, because it suits the United States to proceed in that manner. As you said, you see, the question that United States raised a few years ago or has been troubled by is the rise of China using the WTO to its advantage, and hence the negation of the WTO and its principles as far as the United States is concerned to stifle the rise of China, any further. So I see a contrasting viewpoints or a contrasting action points as far as both India and United States are concerned in the current context. Convergence in terms of the two pushing forward for multilateralism, therefore, I feel is doubtful. However, I still feel that the relevance, my own opinion is that the relevance of WTO has to be, or multilateralism has to somehow be established, but how it has to be established cannot be in the old format. I think we have to be able to identify new areas of work, new areas of trade domains, that the multilateralism or that WTO has to really look for as its main agenda items. Multilateralism cannot be talking about small bits, or in terms of supporting or just making statements in terms of negating protectionism, etc. I think it needs to do more in terms of being able to identify new areas of work for itself, whether that be in terms of the intersection of climate change and trade, which I think is coming to the fore as one major issue, that is being taken up by countries, and consolidation of regionalism increasingly, reflection of protectionism. So I think the identification of new areas for multilateralism to revive itself and to establish its relevance, that's a very, very important aspect, that has to be taken up by the WTO, by India, to push forward. Whether this can be done by India alone, whether India and United States can do it, I think we need to work upon it under different formats. Whether IPEF can be the format, I doubt very much, because IPEF, as Mark stated, is concentrated more in terms of supply chain resilience, and in a way, sidestepping what is politically difficult domestically as far as the United States is concerned in terms of tariffs, liberalization, etc., and moving forward only with the supply chain aspect, although that cannot be done without looking at the trade pillar, I feel, without looking at market access issues, So in somehow the contradictions that have arisen, as far as bilateralism is concerned and multilateralism is concerned, these need to be resolved separately. What WTO needs to be relevant for needs to be identified on a separate platform. I think that is where we need to put our heads together to see how the WTO can, or multilateralism can continue to be relevant for the world in terms of continuing to maintain the importance of trade as far as growth and development is concerned. I'll stop here.
Brilliant, Amita. You just took just 5 minutes, and that was brilliant. May I turn to Raju, please? Raju, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think I'm the only person from industry on this panel.
So I sandwiched you.
And to be very honest with you, I'm no longer deeply involved with trade negotiation as I was earlier. I've been to 4 of the ministerial rounds as the industry representative, and in the last 5 or 6 years, I've really taken a back seat. I was also heading the ICC Trade Commission, the International Chamber of Commerce Trade Commission at one point of time. And I know that the ICC is working towards a paper also to again see how WTO can be revived. But nevertheless, getting to the topic, I share a bit of the skepticism which is going around the room, and I think it started with Mark, about whether we are really on the same page when it comes to the US and India. Because if we, and Pradeep, you use the words, whether we are walking the talk, I think, actions on both sides are very different from what we are talking about. So I want to just put it in context. Number one, the effect of the pandemic. There was a huge disruption of supply chains, which in itself puts the entire context of multilateral trade as being an integrator of the supply chain into question. The second is that as far as the US and India are concerned, both of us talk from large domestic market perspectives where trade becomes less critical to our economic development than for many other countries who are dependent on trade. The third is that we have, now, the whole world, I would say, and even India and the US have now started indulging in unbridled competition to bring manufacturing of onshoring of manufacturing. And through incentives, through subsidies, the US has this $1.7 trillion climate program, which is called the climate program, but essentially it deals with providing subsidies for or incentives to bring, for onshoring of manufacturing. The fourth point I have is that the climate change and the whole context of carbon taxes, I think Amita ji mentioned something about, the context of WTO where it needs to recognize the newer issues. And I think one of those newer issues is this whole question of climate change. I'd like to flag three more issues. One of challenge in trade in health, trade in privacy in the context of the data economy, and trade and national security. I think these issues also need to be brought into the table for WTO. Then I think also in the geopolitical context, in the context of electoral politics, the loss of jobs and the fear of loss of jobs to technology and to offshoring of manufacturing. Then we talked about food security concerns. Then there are issues on immigration and migration. There is also the issue of growing disparities amongst, the economic disparities, the growing gap between the rich and the poor. And so I think that we are really, many of these objectives are getting blurred. So I am not very, very confident about how the US and India can really work together, except the biggest hope I have is that because of this common problem of China, and because India becomes strategically important for the US, I think that in itself can be a driver to change the ethos and the way in which we can collaborate. And one of those demonstrations was in 2013 with the trade facilitation agreement, which was, finalized in Bali and which Mark referred to. So I am a little, I am not so hopeful about it. I do feel, however, that WTO needs also to integrate the bilateral and plurilateral agreements into its own system, and how that can become a part of the rule-based system, which, so even if it is not a multilateral system, it can be it's like a, a federation of systems where you have a large number of bilateral and plurilateral agreements which become part of the dispute settlement of WTO. Now, as far as the agenda is concerned for the visit of the Prime Minister this time, I think, on one side we talk about multilateralism, on the other side we want to resolve our disputes at WTO level on an outside, out of the court or out of the WTO mechanism system. I think we should really be talking about how to revive the appellate body, and with or without the US, that I think is one of the most important things which need to be done. And I quite agree with you also, Pradeep, when you say that, to think of WTO minus the one big player, China, is almost impossible. So integrating only with the market economy is really not, it's a utopian concept, which I don't think can ever really, because China is, whether we like it or not, the biggest player in the room. So I think that all this we have to put in context of the impact of the financial crisis, the impact of the pandemic, the impact of the Ukraine war, the disturbed geopolitical situation. All of these are going to ultimately impact trade. And whether we like it or not, if there is disruption in the global chain systems, each one would like to make their own security the primary focus of importance. And also, if we are going to reduce the disparities, economic disparities within the individual countries, that also will require job creation. And the proliferation of technology is being perceived as something which will ultimately impact jobs. Whether it will or will not, history says that it will not, because there have been changes in history, whether it was the Luddite movement, etc. It suggests that technology is not going to take away jobs, but nevertheless, we can't remove that fear. That fear is very much there.
Thank you very much. I think you
That's
made your points. Your points were very excellent when you talked about this strategic relationship between US and India itself could be a driver to many other things which are not necessarily easy to do. But anyway, having said that, may I request Veena? Veena Jha? Is Veena, are you there? Veena?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, okay. So I have only 3 points to make. The first is taking a leaf out of Mark's book. Where do we disagree? Where does US and India disagree on the WTO landscape? And I feel they are red lines for India, and I'm sure they are red lines for the US too. The first is the appellate body, which many of you have talked about, but this is a strict red line for India. And India cannot agree with the US on the elimination of this two-tier system of dispute settlement, and neither can many of the other members of the WTO agree. So I feel the appellate body issue, if it needs to be solved outside the WTO and then brought into the WTO in the framework of the TPF, where we are looking at the 7 disputes that we have had with the WTO, with US, and we are finding ways of solving these disputes outside the US, does it give us some lessons for the two-tier system? We have to examine that, and it has to be brought in the context of the WTO. The second issue that I have is on transparency, because the committee system of the WTO works very well. It is, in fact, one of the few systems in the WTO which work very well at this point of time. But the point is, will the committee system move away from consensus? Consensus is one point where India cannot give in. The WTO is built on consensus, and even if there are plurilateral agreements, the point is the governance has to be by consensus. Whatever comes out has to be MFNized, as they say. So we have to think of ways in which the consensus principle is not diluted. And this can be done within the framework of TPF, because we are doing it, for example, in the context of digital trade, we are doing it in the context of standards for medicines, we are doing it in the context of testing, we are doing it in several other contexts in the TPF, and we have to see what can be done in that. In transparency, I don't think technical assistance is the answer to it, because the moment you talk of transparency and enhancing transparency in the WTO, they say, yeah, the LDCs need technical assistance. Let us give them technical assistance. But that's not the point. The point is that the WTO has introduced several regulations, systems, even I would say agreements, which are not fully comprehensible to the LDCs. And they say you should bring LDCs up to speed, but that's not the answer. The answer is understanding how these could impact LDCs. And
Veena, can I request you, if you can focus more on the subject of India and US working together?
That's what I'm talking about. Transparency, for example, India and US are working towards transparency in the TPF. But if the US or other countries other than the US insist that transparency in the WTO means technical assistance, then that's a point of no-go between the two countries. Technical assistance is not the answer. The answer is what are the likely impacts of the different regulations, for example, labor, environment, etc., on other developing countries, and can we develop a mutual understanding on that? There, SDT becomes very important, and SDT is not about, should we treat them differentially, but should we give more time? What should be done to understand these impacts better?
How do you think that US and India can work together to promote the WTO?
I think these are the 3 points. First of all, on the appellate body, if the US disagrees with the appellate body, then it should move out and let other countries develop a consensus on it and see if it agrees with the consensus, because all other countries are agreed on the appellate body but the US. The second issue is on transparency. As I said, transparency not so much in the form of notification, but in the form of examining impacts on the other countries. And also, the US and India can work together to examine the impacts. For example, the hydrogen cell technology. It's moving at a very fast pace in different countries like Germany, India, and the US, but to bring it to others and exactly what it would do in the solar energy context or in the renewable energy context would be very important. And the third issue, as I said, is consensus. We have to look at consensus both in the committee system, the dispute resolution system, and we have to look in on the principle of consensus in plurilaterals. What are you going to do with the outcome of the plurilaterals? Are you going to implement it by consensus, or how are you going to do it?
I think what you said is a very valid point, that is the governance should be done by consensus. It's not necessarily the negotiations.
No, the negotiations can be what they are, because countries which are far ahead.
It has to be MFNized, as you have suggested.
Yeah.
Having done that, the governance has to be, through consensus.
Exactly.
Very good point.
So this has to be taken up, and these two issues, and I'd love to hear what Mark has to say on this, because I'm sure he'll have a lot to say on this.
We'll come back to Mark after I've finished with the...
So these are the basic points, but I also want to make one point on agricultural subsidies, and I'll stop over there. On agricultural subsidies, while India and US cannot agree on the whole gamut of subsidies, and also the green box, the domestic support, etc., one area where India and US have a meeting ground is on the area of product-specific subsidies. And there, I think further progress can be made. And here, India and US could work together to bring something to
Veena, can you define product-specific subsidies for a lay audience?
Sure. For example, the US has been challenging of late outside the WTO, but in the committee system, let me put it, the rice subsidies that so-called India has been providing, also under the basis rice, R-I-C.
Right, paddy. Okay.
Paddy subsidies that it has been providing. So it's quite possible to go into in-depth on some of these product-specific subsidies and find out, even within the PDS context, what exactly is happening and what can be done. So similarly, the US subsidy on wheat, the US subsidy on many other issues can be taken up. Yeah, cotton. Yeah, cotton. Yeah, cotton. But cotton, the Cotton 4 initiative has been quite transparent on some of the subsidies, but never mind, nevertheless.
The whole Cancun ministerial flop because of the C4.
Exactly. So we have to go forward on product-specific subsidies and see what we can do to bring some rationality into WTO discussions on agriculture. I'll stop over there. There are many issues, but I don't want to cloud the argument.
Thank you very much, Veena. You were within 7 minutes in spite of my interruptions. Congratulations. Having said that, let me now invite Pritam Banerjee. Pritam, now I must tell the audience that we've had 3 experts speak before us. Amita is a professor of economics in JNU. Raju Kanoria is a thinking businessman who I have known for a long time and understands state policy, economics, etc. very well. And then Veena Jha has been with the UNCTAD for a long time and is now an independent scholar. So I did not introduce any of them. I thought that the audience knows who they are. Having said that, may I now request Pritam? Pritam is the head of Center for WTO Studies, which is a Commerce Ministry's center. Pritam, over to you.
Thank you, Pradeep ji. And again, like Mr. Agrawal, I would like to preface my comments by saying that these are my personal views and are not fully reflective of the positions in the government. With that caveat, I think first I would like to start with what Mr. Kanoria said. that we have to understand the context of where we are today. Because, if we are going to have a rules-based international order, then the international order is the rules are a function of the international order at that point in time. So you have to look at the international order as is today. And we have had, as was pointed out, two main things that are going on. One is the pandemic and the supply chain disruptions that followed. But at the same time, for the last decade, we have had a huge technical transition that is happening, technological transition that is happening. Modes of production, consumption, distribution are going through a radical shift. But with that, we have had the rise of China, because in the early 2000s, the Chinese manufacturing giant was only competing with the lower end of the spectrum, so with developing countries and LDCs. But now you have a situation where they're competing even with the advanced industrialized economies, and thereby the the pushback that we are seeing. So what the world we are living in is essentially a multi-speed world. And in a multi-speed world with different countries having different priorities, you can never have a perfect multilateral system as a response to it. So what could be then, given the context you have provided us, some of the areas where collaboration and cooperation can happen? I think I'll take I'll break it into four specific areas. There are issues where, given the geopolitical situation today, there might be greater appreciation between India and the US, and solutions can be found. At least agreement between these two countries can be found, which can lead to a multilateral solution. And there I would pick agriculture. India's need for, public, the entire idea of public procurement, our distribution systems, food security, and the public stockholding issues. If there is, through the Trade Policy Forum, greater appreciation of the India's genuine needs, as opposed to, doing this for trade distortion, which it doesn't do, in that case, I think progress can be made. And I think that the TPF does provide space for that to happen. And I'm more optimistic than Mark and others in that context. Second, you have existing...
Pritam, what you just said is into what India should ask for. What about US?
No, I'm coming to that.
On agriculture, in your first point.
I think, I'll take the Indian point of view here. I think it's for the US to define what they want from India in that sense. But I think the critical goal from an Indian perspective is to ensure food security and the public stockholding. And that's the critical role, critical ask of us, which is non-negotiable. So in that sense, to that extent, if we find that space from the US, there is space for us to make progress on some agreement. The second, the second basket of issues really are related to where existing rules can be improved. So there are, in areas like SPS and TVT, where there can be some areas of collaboration. There are small incremental spaces for collaboration between the US and India, which to improve the multilateral system as such. I think the challenge is to look at the third basket, where the multi-speed becomes very effective. And here I'm talking about areas such as the JSI on digital, and where the plurilaterals are being pushed. Now, over here, I think the deliberative function of the WTO, which we're supposed to drive purely some kind of principles, is actually going at a rapid speed to develop rules in areas where no country has domestic regulations, fully cooked today. Right? This is an area which covers multiple aspects of the global economy. We have not defined what it actually covers. Even European Union has just come up with its regulations on artificial intelligence. Even the advanced countries are grappling with domestic regulation. It's a very uncanny situation. You have never had this transition in history, where domestic regulations are not formed, you're trying to develop global rules. This kind of jump is something which, when the multi-speed world with LDCs, developing countries, advanced economies all together, is, I think, a mistake. Principles are fine. Moment you move it to developing global rules, essentially it becomes a coalition of the willing. And coalition of the willing, which is trying to come to an agreement, will typically lead to suboptimal outcomes. Because the coalition of the willing is then being pushed by certain interests, which might even turn out to be contradictory to what the advanced countries and their societies want in the long term, without understanding what's really happening. So over there, I think we have to be very careful, because the rules that will emerge from there might be very, very suboptimal. There, the agreement that these platforms are basically at the high level principles, and the issues, the substantive rulemaking can happen in smaller groups where areas like IPEF come in, because essentially again the geopolitics come to play. And I would like to then go back to the point that was made about China, because in many of these areas, and there are two that stand out, the emerging proclivity for industrial policy, and this has come to stay. I don't think we can wish it away. What the US is doing with the CHIPS Act and the ITA, what the EU is attempting with the CBAM, this has come to stay. Industrial policy in the guise of environment or other issues is come. So in industrial policy, the idea would be then amongst a coalition, a small group of countries to come up with ideas and principles, and US, India can take the lead of what is the margins of fairness.
Thank you.
That,
Thank
we
you
have,
very much.
and the last point over here is in the areas like digitalization. What is the evolution towards global rules in small groups? Again, because in both these contexts, China will be an outlier, because it has a non-market economy. In both these aspects, it is easier for countries like India and US to collaborate and not perhaps have a giant in the room like China, which is in a different island.
Thank you very much, Pritam. Thank you very much. And that is again within 7 minutes. Let me now come to Anuradha. Anuradha, are you there?
Hi. Thanks, Mr. Mehta.
Hi, Anuradha, welcome. 7 minutes.
Yes. Okay, I think, just pretty much picking up from the points that the other panelists have already made. From what Pritam just said, that a perfect multilateral is not possible. And I agree. And it's never been possible. It's all well said, in terms of looking at the WTO system with a bit of nostalgia, because all said and done, it did present a fair bargain. The rules were not perfect. They were skewed on several counts, but at the same time, it presented a multilateral rules-based enforceable mechanism. Also echoing from what Mr. Kanoria said, the trust deficit in the entire globalization, trade multilateralism started off perhaps with the 2008 financial crisis. Protectionism has been growing since then, and it perhaps exacerbated with the COVID pandemic, the US-China tensions, the Ukraine-Russia war, etc. Now, there is the cynical view also, and in fact, you mentioned Prabhash's article in the beginning of this session, and he quotes Jeffrey Schwartz of the Peterson Institute, that perhaps at the end of the day, a weak WTO perfectly suits the US as part of its foreign policy aimed at strategic rivalry with China. Now, if that is true, that's highly myopic, because again, as everyone in this room would agree, we've just come too far ahead in terms of global economic interdependence. And perhaps it is that political realism which is driving the recent initiatives between US and China to smoothen their differences. And I do remain a little hopeful on that count. Now, coming to what is it that the two countries can do together? Yes, again, these basket of issues have been dwelt upon by all the other speakers before me. But the points that I really wanted to highlight was starting with the WTO dispute settlement system. One, I do not think a WTO without the US, or with WTO dispute settlement system without the US, is ever going to be possible. And I do hope that some degree of political realism will again make the US, which has been the only outlier to the appellate body system, to try and revisit that and perhaps arrive at some kind of synergy with the others. Because no other alternative, including the EU's proposed compromise of a potential second-tier arbitral mechanism, will ever match the degree of confidence that the appellate body can really engender in the entire system. Veena made a point about how the two countries have come together, India and US have come together to resolve disputes, the WTO disputes, through mutually agreed solution. Even that mutually agreed solution rests and emerges from the WTO dispute settlement system itself. It's pretty much within that framework. So hopefully there will be some degree of revisiting that by the US by MC13, which is scheduled for February next year to address that. Mark referred to the role that US and India played to both forge the public stockholding temporary solution in 2013, as well as the agreement towards the trade facilitation agreement. I mean, and while India was predominantly one of the key makers of the temporary solution for public stockholding, it has not in the past 10 years managed to arrive at a permanent solution. Now, this is an area where India has the support of the G33 countries, the African Union. And again, perhaps it's wishful thinking, but if we can see a permanent solution to the PSH related issue, that would be another remarkable achievement where perhaps the two countries can work together. This takes me to the third point in terms of the plurilateral initiative, the joint initiatives, and again, echoing the views of several of the speakers before me. This is an area where India, as being the outlier, perhaps has not done much of a service to its own position, its own role in rulemaking. Among the joint initiatives, as you would know, Pradeep, the domestic regulation initiative was one where India was playing an extremely active role way up to 2011-12 in terms of the disciplines, the nature of the disciplines. And perhaps it is time to bring this entire initiative back into the multilateral fold. I do not see it as being impossible at all. Among the others, the other initiatives, whether it is e-commerce, whether it is MSMEs, whether it is investment facilitation, elements of these are already being negotiated as part of our free trade agreements. By staying out of the multilateral room in terms of the joint initiatives, all that we are losing out is the ability to try and influence those rules, particularly if we are serious about building in the special and differential treatment component as a fundamental part of those rules. We really need to be in the room to try and achieve. Now, coming to the issue that you've been raising with all the other speakers in terms of whether the bilateral cooperation and collaboration, how does that dovetail with trade multilateralism? Well, I do not see any natural ways in which it can, because the IPEF to a large extent remains somewhat of a mystery, despite the various political statements that have come out and the substantial conclusion of the supply chain component of the IPEF pillar. India has so far continued to remain out of the trade pillar. It's also unlikely, whether remaining out of whether IPEF sort of architecture can provide any real benefits that a traditional FTA can. So, for example, there's been reference to the US Inflation Reduction Act by the previous speakers in terms of its massive largesse for incentivizing manufacturing within the US. Now, there is a component of the IRA which provides certain exceptions for US FTA partners. And those FTA partners today include Australia, Mexico, Canada, South Korea, Peru, Chile, etc. Now, being a member of IPEF, I do not think will ever entitle India to those same degree of concessions or exceptions. In terms of what the IPEF architecture would really, you wanted to say.
Anuradha, will you please wind up as ASAP?
Perfect. I mean, absolutely. The only point that I was making was in terms of IPEF's own architecture, in terms of its emphasis on supply chain, etc. I do not see it being disengaged from the trade component, because each of those elements, whether we are talking about supply and resilience to any of our critical sectors and key goods, without trade facilitation, without trade market access, those pillars cannot exist. So each of those IPEF pillars will actually end up informing each other. What sort of architecture will actually emerge out of it, whether that can supplement our engagement in the multilateral, I'm not sure. But what it does provide is a platform for the two countries to engage. And if that can provide the basis for further strengthening the multilateral, then so be it.
Thank you very much, Anuradha. That was brilliant. Then I request the last but one speaker, Pranav Kumar. Pranav, over to you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
thank you very much, sir.
And Raju, just to tell you that Pranav represents the Reliance Industries. He's no longer with the CII.
So that is what I wanted to say, that I am the second speaker from industry. So Mr. Kanoria is not all alone. So,
Raju, are you there? Raju gone. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so after hearing all the my previous panelists, the sense which I am getting that majority of most of the speakers are not very optimistic when we talk about reforming WTO, and more importantly, when we talk about India, US coming to some kind of convergence on long list of issues to drive this agenda forward. So that is one point which I get the sense from the panelists. Second is that since I am representing industry, and industry particularly, of course, no discussion happening within the industry of this with regards to WTO and what is happening there. Because the fact is that when there is no predictability attached, there is no time period attached, of course, industry cannot plan, businesses cannot plan their strategy. So whatever I am going to speak is again my own personal viewpoint. So that I wanted to clarify it. Now coming to the subject, so before I share my perspective on the reform agenda, so there are four broad functions of WTO, if I may define it. First, of course, the trade negotiating work. Second is dispute resolution. Third is the trade policy review. And fourth is the capacity building and the whole developmental dimension aspect. So now the moot question is, if we are able to reform the WTO, can the reformed WTO inject the necessary life to the top two work of WTO, that is trade negotiating agenda and dispute resolution? That is a $1 million question. Now coming to the reform agenda, and in fact, Mr. Mehta, you mentioned about that there is a political intent, because of course both India and US, they are signatory to the political declaration which was signed at the G20, and of course in the TPF also. But ground realities are entirely different. If we see the list of the reform agenda items, whether it's a decision-making process, dispute resolution, transparency and notification, self-designating developing country status, SNDT, negotiating function, which is of course plurilateral, and also all these issues we don't see much convergence between US and India, particularly issues like the SNDT and self-designating developing country status. So for instance, US is saying that OECD country and G20 members should not themselves self-designate the developing country status. So these are the very challenging issues which we see in case of when India, US collaborating to drive the WTO reform agenda forward. Now coming to the trade negotiating agenda, as I said that if we are able to reform the WTO, so can we discuss the core negotiating agenda? For instance, the industrial tariffs, agriculture tariff, and also the services aspect. Industrial tariffs, we have gone too far in terms of through FTAs and regional trade agreement, and we have substantially liberalized across to the various free trade agreements. All countries have gone forward. But can we try to bring the agriculture agenda back on the negotiating table? I have my own doubt. I don't think this is happening. So coming to the services particularly, so mode 1, 2, 3, and 4. Mode 2, of course, is the consumption driven. The consumer moves forward to the supplier's territory. Mode 3 is investment driven, where again, large number of developing countries, they do not have much capacity to invest. Mode 4 agenda, again, I don't think this is coming back to the WTO negotiating table. And we talk about US and India. US has been the major opponent in terms of bringing blocking any progress on the mode 4 in the WTO. Now that leaves the new issues. So like all those plurilateral initiatives which are on the table in the not in the WTO, but of course through the plurilateral arrangement, whether it's a digital trade or e-commerce or investment facilitation, gender issues, sustainability, and MSMEs. So if we are able to reform the WTO and bring these issues on negotiating table again, if you know the position of India on all these issues, India has not been part of any of these initiatives. So I don't see much convergence. And again, I would add to what Marx has said, that he is not very optimistic. Even Mr. Kanoria also and other panelists also said that the situation may not be very optimistic, but of course, India and US bilaterally, we are seeing a lot of convergence. We are negotiating IPEF, and of course, the Prime Minister Modi has gone. So if something happened at the very highest political level, and they decide to drive the agenda forward, then of course down the line it might translate into some concrete action. And of course, it is India's presidency. Of course, we'll have to see, because this is one of the agenda item in India's presidency also, how to strengthen and reform the multilateralism. So it's not only the trade multilateralism, but multilateralism per se, because multilateralism at this point of time, it is facing the crisis, whether it's at the political level or at the, whether we are talking the climate change negotiation or trade negotiations, all front, the multilateral process is facing challenges. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Pranav. Thank you very much. That was excellent. Again, well within time. Every panelist has been very well disciplined, and all of you deserve a big hand from me. Big applause for having maintained the time. You know, it's very difficult to moderate a meeting where you have so many excellent speakers with excellent points, and then you have to look at the clock as well. Having said that, may I request Prabhash? Prabhash, are you there? Prabhash Ranjan. He was coming and going. Maybe there's something wrong with his video. Or...
Yeah, I'm here.
You are here. Would you like to speak for 2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah, sure. I'm not able to switch on my video because my internet is quite unstable. So
no problem.
If I just
no problem. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, first, I think it's good to talk about whether India and US can converge on some of these issues. But the reality is that US, as I believe, is not really interested in trade multilateralism at this point. Just to sort of substantiate my point by giving you an example of what the US is doing with the appellate body. Now, we all know that the US is chiefly responsible for stalling it. But on the one hand, US talks about the problems in the DSU. But then on the other hand, it doesn't offer concrete solutions. So it says that the appellate body has been using the system of precedence. But when it is asked to clarify on this, it kind of deflects on this question and doesn't offer any concrete suggestion on how to fix this problem, if at all it is a problem. So this clearly reveals an attitude of trying to block something by time in the process and not quite suggest the way forward or concrete solutions to this. So if you look at US's approach to dispute settlement, that in itself clearly tells us the US attitude to trade multilateralism. And the reason why US has adopted this approach is because US doesn't want the policing function of the WTO to work properly, because it wants to kind of have a sort of, use trade unilateralism to a great extent. So therefore, I'm also pessimist, like many other panelists whom I have heard, on whether there can be any convergence, at least on the question of WTO reforms.
Thank you. Have you finished, Prabhash?
No, I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Raju, you were away for a while, but Pranav Kumar, who works with Reliance Industries, spoke, saying that he was the second industry man in this room.
Yeah, I was
said
not,
that, may I now request, sorry.
I was not away, Pradeep. I just switched off my video. I've been listening.
No problem. May I request, Mark, do you have any last words? Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Pradeep. I mean, this has been hugely interesting, and obviously, I'm a very unique minority of one among how many of us are 29 now. So it's a very interesting position to be in. But that that said, I feel
excuse me, may I correct you, Mark? We are also on YouTube. So there are over 100 participants outside.
So okay, many more. So, but what is hugely encouraging for me with this group of speakers is that I agreed with so much. I mean, others may have noticed me often shaking my head up and down and agreeing, and I don't think I actually shook it horizontally in terms of not agreeing. If I just to provide some perspective, the crisis in the WTO and multilateralism is not just over the last 4 or 5 years and specific to the appellate body. It goes back well before that in terms of the Doha round, which I think in retrospect was a mistake. I was a huge supporter at the time as a trade negotiator, but I think it existentially affected the future of the organization. And if we had a large group of U.S. negotiators, former U.S. negotiators, U.S. industry, I think we'd have a very different perspective about the responsibility of India in that, the diminishment of relevance for the WTO. But that said, I agreed with so much of what was being said. The appellate body is a unique issue. That last comment about that being the only sign of the U.S. view on multilateralism being the appellate body, I just can't agree with. I mean, it's a unique area. I agree that all sides should work together to fix the appellate body, and I fear that in the United States and specifically at USTR, there's a perspective among some of the lawyers which I don't agree with. I think that there should be more efforts to solve the appellate body crisis, but I think more broadly, with respect to moving ahead with plurilaterals, using the committee system, there remains a strong interest to find ways forward in the WTO, and that's why I come to the bilateral side, because my experience, I spent most of my career WTO, multilateral. I was in Geneva for 6 years. Soon after the creation of the WTO, I was the assistant USTR for WTO, and it was always terrible with India. It was never good. We had some unique moments like Bali where we came together, but it was rarely good. My last 2 years, I was the assistant USTR for South and Central Asia, and I was negotiating bilaterally, and it was completely different. I mean, the dynamic was much more positive and constructive, and let's get things done, let's figure things out, let's be creative. And that's why I think, and the relationships, the personal relationships were better. And that's why I think if there were an agenda bilaterally to look at WTO issues, there would be some promise of moving ahead in positive ways. And I do think that the strategic element, and I didn't even reference China for the most part, but I think the strategic interest can drive the bilateral trade agenda in terms of it being a positive one. So I do hope that there can be ideas put forward for the Trade Policy Forum to start to discuss some of these WTO issues. Public stock holding is a hard one. Appellate body is also challenging, but there's much to discuss related to the WTO agenda that could be done bilaterally, and the two sides ideally could team up eventually in Geneva.
Thank you very much, Mark, and that was excellent. I wanted Rajesh Agrawal, the Additional Secretary, Commerce Ministry, to speak. Unfortunately, he sent a message that the internet in their office is down, which even Pranav Kumar experienced before coming here. He was in a meeting with the Commerce Ministry. Having said that, I'm an optimist. The problem is just that having been an activist, a passionate activist, I'm an optimist, and you cannot but be an optimist in order to achieve whatever you want to achieve. And I have seen many changes happening which were impossible at one time to even think about that these changes could happen. So therefore, I see that there could be some meeting grounds, and I agree with you that some of the plurilaterals, which even Rajesh Agrawal spoke about, there was no reason, no business of India to stay out of them. There are several things that we have seen India stays out unnecessarily with some kind of standing on a high moral ground as if as if we are holding the world. And what I said earlier to Rajesh Agrawal is that today we are working for not only India, but we are working for the global South. The global South is looking up at us. And therefore, that is something which will come out of G20, and that is what we must be aware of. And that is a message which I would like all my colleagues in this from India in this particular webinar to think about, is that you're no longer thinking about India, you're looking at the whole developing world. Pranav said one thing which is very important, that US has been wanting countries like India, huge economies, emerging market economies, to be outside the developing country status. Now, I don't see any reason why we should be in the developing country status. If we have ambitions and aspirations to become a $10 trillion economy, we must start behaving like one and thinking like one. We cannot remain a developing country all our lives. Already small countries are graduating from LDCs to DCs, Bangladesh, Nepal, etc., and so many of them. Why are they doing it? What is the reason that we have to think about? And as far as India is concerned, there are things that we must think about. Maybe that might be a meeting ground with the US. And look, we're okay, fine. We are a large economy and we are a growing economy. We should become $10 trillion in the next few years. And a rich country by 2047, that is the ambition which the Honorable Prime Minister has spoken about. So if you want to become a rich country by 2047 with at least $8,000 or $7,000 per capita, then we must think in those lines. And the trouble is that none of our bureaucracy thinks on those lines. And there was a rare exception that Rajesh Agrawal, who I must applaud, came and participated in this event, and just for the fact that otherwise even civil servants don't come and participate. Pritam is an exception. He's not a civil servant as such. He's now become a civil servant. Pritam, over to you.
Thank you. I'll just take a couple of minutes, and this is with reference to the point Pradeep ji you made on the...
A minute or two.
Yeah, on the plurilaterals. On plurilaterals, because, I in principle agree with what you are saying and what, even Anuradha said, that being out of the room takes away the opportunity to frame the rules. But the point that we need to be a little bit cautious about, that Veena ji was mentioning, is precisely that the rules that will emerge from here need to be driven by consensus in the background, where forums like the TPF provide an opportunity to come to some agreement, because there are certain areas where the principles of what those rules would be are still a work in progress. And there is enormous amount of lack of understanding of what those are. And the whole e-commerce is a great example of that, as opposed to maybe some of the other JSIs. So India's reluctance, one is the high, what you described as, being on a quote unquote on a high horse, but there is also on a moral ground, but there is also genuine concern about the fact that what would be the timelines, because the plurilateral can become, and we have seen this before, a coalition of the willing, because assuming that you don't agree, that's what the Veena ji was mentioning, you are left out, fine. But a majority of these countries make those rules, and maybe a large number of those countries become what, to use a wrong word in the wrong forum, the coalition of the willing. And I'm referring back to what was happening in the early 2000s in a very different context. So we cannot afford that situation in areas which will be of critical importance to our global economy, e-commerce being one, domestic regulation being the other. So caution, yes, I agree we should be there. But the modalities we have to approach with caution, and there I think the US and India can work together to clear the air, and then perhaps the next stage comes.
Thank you very much. Over to Bipul Chatterjee to propose a vote of thanks. Bipul, are you there?
One point Pradeep, can I just make one point?
Please, hurry up.
And this is, where collaboration can take place. CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is being proposed in the context of climate change. There are many ways of establishing equivalence in that context. And we've just put in a paper at G20 on that. So this is something that the two countries must talk about and arrive at a consensus.
On CBAM?
Yeah, on CBAM.
Even US and EU have a problem.
Yes, that's why I feel that, this is the time to work on it, to arrive at some principles of equivalence. For example, between taxes on fossil fuels and ETS, the emission.
Let me restate the point which I made, that if India has to become a $10 trillion economy or $25 trillion economy, we have to start thinking like that. Yeah. Unfortunately, we're still thinking as if we are a $500 billion economy. And so that, Vipul, over to you.
Thank you.
Anuradha has a point. Vipul, just a minute.
Quickly, just on the point of CBAM, I do agree that, in terms of perhaps the US could be a potentially natural ally because of our common differences against EU's unilateral measure. Having said that, the US itself is also thinking about some kind of border taxation, which could also be a matter of concern. And I agree with you, Pradeep, in terms of, the ambition that India has. But equally, there is also the sanctity of international environmental norms, which we are negotiating in other forums. So unless, of course, ideally, there could be one global architecture which under which everything is discussed, because we do know that trade, social related issues and environmental are all equal pillars of the concept of sustainability.
Thank you very much.
But we can't take elements of one and then negate that or dilute that.
Sorry, Pradeep, I just need to come 30 seconds intervention. One is not disputing the environmental coherence that is required in the global economy. One is only disputing the mechanisms to achieve carbon border adjustment mechanism. And what we are proposing, and in fact, we have put in a paper at T20 on this, is that there are several mechanisms, whether they are regulatory, taxes on fossil fuels, or the ETS, the emission trading system. There are several regulatory mechanisms that can be considered equivalent. And this is where, in fact, my two co-authors were one from Australia and one from Germany. And this is the point that we want.
You didn't have a author from
No,
US.
we didn't have a co-author.
Anyway, send it to the US government.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Vipul, over to you.
Thank you. Let me join Mehta and my other colleagues in thanking you for this very enriching discussion, I would say. And if you may allow me, while thanking you, I would like to pose a couple of questions very, very briefly. One is...
Who's going to answer that, Vipul?
No, nobody.
We run out of time.
Yeah, just questions. Are we clear about who are the winners and who are the losers of this stalemate in the WTO's dispute settlement system? So that is something we need to ponder over. Secondly, and this is not just for Mark, you, but for all of us, can we have another Franklin Roosevelt? Big question. Was one of the architects of the Bretton Woods. I am not very sure about it, but I will end with the optimism as expressed by Mr. Mehta. Thank you, all of you. And I can assure you that we're going to take forward this agenda on, I wouldn't say revival, or maybe revival of trade multilateralism. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening and day for Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't fully catch the question.
The one was that, are we clear about who are the winners and who are the losers of the stalemate in the WTO's dispute settlement system? And second question was much larger. Can we have another Franklin Roosevelt?
Can we have another what?
Franklin Roosevelt, your former president, was one of the architects of the Bretton Woods.
Okay, I'm still not catching the second one. You know, on
Anyway,
the
we'll talk later. Yeah, thank you.
yeah, on the appellate body, I think my own view, and I think many people who are formerly USTR or even currently USTR on the policy side would like to see it resolved once and for all. I mean, I think there were legitimate concerns about how the appellate body was operating and overreaching, but it's time to get over it and to negotiate some reforms that allow for the appellate body to be operational again, unless in fact the objective of some, and I think it's a minority, I'm not sure if that includes the USTR, Catherine Tai, who was formerly working at the general counsel's office at USTR, was a lawyer at USTR. There may be some who actually prefer there not to be an appellate body, but I think many of us would like to see it resolved. And I think all countries are losers by not having an appellate body that is operational, because it does make dispute settlement, it diminishes the value of dispute settlement. If there can be, if there can be panel decisions that are not then reviewed and finalized through an appeal, then and consequently it's appealed into the void and there's no finality. I don't think there's any winners, systemically with respect to that.
Thank you. So thank you very much. And till we meet again, have a nice evening, a nice day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.